The World Health Organization estimates that roughly 264 million people on the planet currently have a diagnosed anxiety disorder. Many more than that struggle with anxiety on a daily basis, and many more than that will at some point in their life go through phases of exaggerated or disordered anxiety. So, anxiety disorders are a thing that a high percentage of people on planet Earth are going to have to deal with at some point. Now, getting diagnosed with an anxiety disorder can sometimes be welcome because in the midst of our struggle, finally we have an explanation as to why we've been feeling this way. However, more often than not, a diagnosis of an anxiety disorder can be devastating and cause us to become even more anxious about what this now means for our future. In this video, I'm going to clear up the confusion surrounding anxiety disorders and explain exactly why your diagnosis does not define who you are. I'm Tim Box, I'm a hypnotist, mind coach, and for more than a decade now, I've been working one-to-one with clients to help them overcome all sorts of anxiety-related issues. This video is going to be all about demystifying what an anxiety disorder is and clearing up the confusion that being labelled with one can cause. I'm going to do this by going through the 5 main reasons why a diagnosis of an anxiety disorder doesn't have to define who you are. Now, if you're here because you've been diagnosed with an anxiety disorder, or maybe you're concerned you might have one, or maybe you just know someone who's struggling and you want to be able to understand and help them, then you're in the right place. And hopefully by the end of this video, you'll in some way be feeling a lot better about all this stuff and understand why this particular label is not the final word on your mental health and emotional well-being. Number 1, the diagnostic process. Very often we get diagnosed with some kind of mental or psychological disorder by someone not adequately positioned to do so, like a medical doctor, a complementary therapist, or sometimes we even self-diagnose by reading an article on the internet. But even when we are in front of a mental health professional who is qualified to diagnose psychological or emotional disorders, diagnosing an anxiety disorder can be an extremely hit and miss process. This is because there are no medical tests that can be done to confirm it. Yes, when you go to see your doctor, they will run a number of medical tests, but that's only to rule out any medical causes of your symptoms. Once everything comes back negative, the conclusion by a process of elimination is that this is very likely to be an anxiety issue. Getting an official diagnosis of an anxiety disorder involves describing the way you think, feel, and behave over an extended period of time. It's all based on how we're currently responding to our perceived stressors and the kind of thought processes we're going through in the face of those challenges. All of this is extremely subjective, and putting a definitive label on our own particular emotional experience at any given time is far from definitive. Even if we get diagnosed with what's referred to as a congenital anxiety disorder, suggesting a predisposition to high anxiety is coded into our genes from birth, this is only done by finding out if any of your direct family have experienced high anxiety in the past. There are no genetic tests performed to confirm or refute the diagnosis, and even if there were, there's as yet no telltale anxiety gene that's been discovered that we might actually be testing for. This leads to problems for 2 reasons. Firstly, the reason anxiety gets passed down through generations in a family can just as equally be attributed to learnt behaviour and learnt responses as it can familial genetics. Secondly, the role of genetics in anxiety is largely unknown, but even those that attribute genes as a contributing factor to anxiety issues will tell you that biological elements play at most only a very minor role in why we feel high anxiety. The greater contributing factors are psychological and environmental, both of which are transient and changeable. So a big reason we don't need to feel defined by our diagnosis is that our diagnosis is far from definitive. Reason number 2, the definition of an anxiety disorder. I often see social media posts where people will put up a little graphic that says something like, "Do you have an anxiety disorder?" And then the next slide defines the term in a way that might resonate with the reader. The problem here is that all too often the quote-unquote official definition of an anxiety disorder sounds a lot like we all go through in these strange modern times on a pretty regular basis. For example, the definition I see a lot for generalized anxiety disorder is when you feel anxious about a number of different things on a daily basis for a period of 6 months or more. When you think about it, that definition describes most people on the planet. It's not defining generalized anxiety disorder, it's defining being human and caring about what happens to you. Now, I totally understand that we need definitions of terms, and the type of anxiety we're talking about in these instances is the visceral, high-level stuff that grabs our attention so urgently that our anxiety then becomes the thing we feel most anxious about. However, if we're going to define anxiety disorders as the point where anxiety becomes inappropriately high for the current circumstances, then we've got a problem, because every single person on the planet will at some point have what we might describe as a disordered anxiety response. None of us are immune to interpreting a situation as more threatening than it really is. Our ability to imagine means that at times we will conceptualize a possible negative outcome to some kind of challenge and start to feel physically uncomfortable as our body responds to that thought as if it's real. Do we all have a disorder? Or are we being too general in our labeling of what a disorder actually is? In these modern times where our challenges are about paying bills, turning up to appointments and sending emails, the most appropriate emotional response involves a calm mind and a clear head. Yet how often do we all respond differently to that? Maybe in our attempts to understand and define what's going on with our emotional responses, we've inadvertently started being too hard on ourselves and begun to label misplaced yet healthy responses as indicators of illness, just because they're not ideal. Even when we experience high anxiety levels on a regular basis, it would be a mistake to suggest that often automatically means pathological. This is just another reason why the term anxiety disorder need not define you. Reason number 3, what the word disorder actually means. All too often when we receive a diagnosis of a disorder, there is this inherent unspoken suggestion that this means a permanent state. I've spoken to many clients who have told me they were explicitly told by their mental health professional that they will now have to manage their disorder for the rest of their life. This is not the case. So let's define our terms a little more clearly. The term disorder means nothing more than a state of confusion. We describe our response as disordered because our subconscious has become confused as to what the best course of action is. This is why we feel excessively anxious and in a semi-panic state, even though it seems inappropriate to feel that way in the face of the current challenge. A part of our mind has become confused as to the best course of action and is throwing us a response we struggle to make logical sense of. This is why we very often hear people describe their responses as irrational. Now, they're not irrational, because irrational means without reason. In truth, there's always a reason why we feel a certain way at a certain time, but it's not always a logical reason, and in the case of high anxiety, it's very often a confused response. However, some mental health professionals will then start to tell us that we have a disorder when that disordered response starts to happen too regularly. All it really means is that our mind hasn't yet cleared up that confusion. This is why sometimes a diagnosis of an anxiety disorder is welcomed, because at least now we understand why we feel this way. But in truth, there are much better ways of clearing up this confusion than concluding that we are irretrievably malfunctioning and consigning ourselves to a permanent state of disorder. Most of the time, the reason we get locked in a high anxiety response is because at some point in our journey, the thing we've become most anxious about is whether or not this anxiety will ever go away, and whether there's something wrong with us that we feel this way. Our diagnosis of now having a disorder just perpetuates this concern and sets up a belief system that limits our ability to change. If we can look at an inappropriately high anxiety response simply as a sign that our mind is currently exhibiting emotional confusion, then the journey out the other side of our perceived disorder is simply about clearing up that confusion. Reason number 4, change happens whether we like it or not. As I've already stated, the big problem with an anxiety disorder diagnosis is that it potentially locks us into a high anxiety response by defining our boundaries and limitations based on our understanding of that diagnosis. It also creates further anxiety as it causes us to reevaluate our ability to cope with life's challenges. We start assessing our ability to deal with the daily tasks and start to ponder if these tasks are likely to trigger our anxiety. You see, we all have a version of ourselves that exists in our mind. Our self-image dictates the choices we make from moment to moment. We don't get anxious about the situation we're facing, we get anxious about our perceived ability to cope with that situation. The way we process our upcoming options always involves what version of ourselves we believe is currently available to us. As soon as we add any sort of mental health issue into the mix, it affects every aspect of who we perceive ourselves to be and what we feel we can do. This all too often has a knock-on effect as we start to limit and restrict our decisions based on what our anxiety disorder will allow us to do. However, the good news is that as human beings, change is something we're really good at. We change every day, whether we notice it or not. There's this thing called neuroplasticity. The term was coined in the 1940s and scientists started to talk about it more in the 60s. However, it's only in recent years that we refer to neuroplasticity as an important factor in our emotional responses. The fact is, our brains never stop learning and growing. We used to think there was a point in our life where that stopped, but the concept of neuroplasticity tells us that there isn't. This means that with every piece of information we take in via our five senses, we continue to rewire the connections in our brain. So no matter how hard we try to remain the same, we are constantly changing things about our understanding of the world and how we respond to it. So it really doesn't matter how you're feeling and responding right now, and whether or not those particular set of responses fall into the category of an anxiety disorder, because you're going to continue to learn, grow, and update those responses every day of your life. So your diagnosis of an anxiety disorder might explain the way your mind is currently working, but it falls far short of defining who you are. Okay, the fifth and final reason you don't need to feel defined by any diagnosis: accepting your diagnosis as the story of who you are just limits you. As much as our brain continues to grow as we learn, there are these things called cognitive filters. Our mind is a logical one that likes order. We won't accept that black is also white, good is also bad, and we like to know that when we get out of bed tomorrow morning, the laws of physics will still apply as they did yesterday, and our foot will head towards the floor rather than up to the ceiling. As human beings, we like to feel we can rely on a consistent map of reality. It helps us feel safe. This means that when we accept something as true, we then tend to reject anything that refutes it too directly. An example of this would be the way we like to stick to our political beliefs, even in the face of contradictory evidence. Don't get me wrong, we can always learn and update our map of reality, but there are a lot of things that get filtered out of our awareness or instantly dismissed because they contradict what we feel we know to be irrefutably true. The result of this is that if we get told we have an anxiety disorder and we accept this as our story, then our brain is now invested in actively defending that truth. This limits our ability to grow beyond that particular idea and beyond what we understand to be the characteristics of a person who has that disorder. Some of you will know something about my history and how I suffered a great deal of social anxiety in my school and university years. Now, I consider myself incredibly fortunate that when I was going through this about 30 years ago, it was before the internet, before Dr. Google, and before the word anxiety was really used to describe any kind of disorder or condition, or at least it certainly wasn't in my awareness at the time. So I was never diagnosed with an anxiety disorder, and as a result, never felt defined by any label when it came to the way I felt in certain situations. As the years went on, my environment changed, I grew emotionally, and I started to change the way I was thinking and responding. I was helped by learning a lot about critical thinking and what I would call productively analytical self-reflection. I never saw my own anxiety response as something that I was locked into, and as a result, my natural emotional growth and increased understanding facilitated my journey out of that phase of my life. If I was experiencing those feelings now, I would very probably be diagnosed with either social anxiety disorder or generalized anxiety disorder, and who knows, that might well end up as the story of me. But fortunately, I never saw a professional about my anxiety, and as a result, I was never burdened by the weight of a diagnosis. Had that happened, I might possibly have still managed to come out the other side of all of that, but I suspect the journey would have been vastly different. So the final reason why we don't have to feel defined by our diagnosis is that it doesn't help us to do so. And we'll get the other side of this much easier if we stop trying to manage a disorder. A label can be a heavy burden to bear, and I hope in this video I've given you some useful insights and a few good reasons why when we get diagnosed with an anxiety disorder, this doesn't define who we are or act as the final word on our mental and emotional health. Okay guys, thanks for watching, and if you've enjoyed this video and got something from it, then let me know down in the comments. I'd love to hear your thoughts, and why not check out some of the other episodes on the channel as I put new content up 3 times a week, all about the mind and how we get control of the way we think, feel and behave. Also, please consider subscribing to this channel and sharing this video on your social media. Okay guys, that's it for now. I'm Tim Box, mind coach and remedial hypnotist. I'll see you next time.